The realtor never once offered a walkthrough. He sent 11 photographs, all taken in that golden late afternoon light that makes even a crack house look like a countryside retreat. Every shot was buried under a cascade of thick green vines, the kind you'd see on the cover of a British travel magazine. Charming. Timeless. Yours. Walter and Dorothy Sinclair didn't ask questions. They were 78 years old. They had waited their entire lives for this moment, and they were not about to let it slip through their fingers. They wired every penny they had saved across 53 years of renting. By the following Saturday, they owned Hawthorne Cottage. By the following Monday, they were sitting in rubble. The gardener they'd hired to tidy the overgrowth had barely touched the front wall before the whole facade groaned and came down. The vines hadn't been decorating the house. They'd been holding it up. But here is the part nobody saw coming. What fell out of that wall, hidden inside it for nearly 100 years, would turn the worst day of their lives into something that doesn't have a word for it yet. Stay with me. This one's worth every second. Walter Sinclair had been paying someone else's mortgage since he was 22 years old. Not his words. His daughter Claire's. She'd said it once at the dinner table, half joking, fully accurate, and Walter had gone quiet in the way he did when something landed too close to the truth. His first place had been a basement flat on Grover Street in Mill Haven, Ohio. $42 a month in 1969. The radiator clanked every night like it was filing a complaint, and the bloke upstairs kept a dog that paced until 2 in the morning. Walter had moved in with Dorothy, carrying a card table, 2 fold-up chairs, and the absolute unshakable certainty that this was temporary. Temporary. That word did a lot of heavy lifting over the next 5 decades. A bigger flat when Claire arrived. A rented semi-detached when the kids were school age, a proper garden, a street where children could ride bikes to the corner shop. 14 years in that house, the longest they'd ever stayed anywhere, until the landlord's son finished university and needed it back, just like that. Then a third-floor walk-up with no lift, which had bothered them not at all at 52, and rather a lot at 69. Through every move, every lease, every landlord's knock, Walter and Dorothy shared one understanding: this is not the destination. The destination was a deed. Their names on it. No one else's claim. Dorothy kept a folder. Not on a computer, a real one, manila, slightly battered, second drawer of the bedroom desk. Inside, torn magazine pages, printed listings, photographs taken from car windows. A stone cottage in Vermont was spotted in a waiting room magazine in 1991. A farmhouse in Tennessee they'd nearly bought in 2006 before the financial crisis made the timing wrong again. A house with roses climbing a trellis, photographed through the passenger window one Sunday in 2014 while passing through a town whose name she never caught. The folder was 30 years thick. It was, she sometimes thought privately, the most faithful thing she owned. It had never once stopped believing in her behalf. Walter retired at 72, 3 years late, because the pension was better if you waited, and the pension was what the house depended on. Dorothy had already retired at 68, the year her knees made the third-floor stairs a twice-daily negotiation she refused to keep losing. She was 75 when the number finally came together. Pension. Social Security. Modest savings maintained through decades of careful, not lucky, careful management. The proceeds from selling everything they didn't need to carry, the spare car, the good china, furniture that didn't earn its transport cost. Walter sat at the kitchen table the evening they confirmed it. He looked across at Dorothy and felt something he couldn't immediately name. Not joy exactly. Something quieter. The feeling of a man who has been walking toward a place for 53 years and can finally see the door. "We're going to do it," he said. Quietly. The way you say something that has been true in the future for a very long time and is finally becoming true right now. Dorothy reached across and put her hand on his. She had the expression he'd seen at their wedding. At the births of their children. At his father's funeral. The expression that meant something mattered too much for her usual composure. "We are," she said. The dream, then the first cracks of dread. They'd been browsing listings for 3 weeks when it appeared. Tuesday morning, early spring. Dorothy saw it first. Hawthorne Cottage. Listed by a small agency out of Crestfield, a quiet town in Western Virginia, They'd passed through once on a road trip 15 years ago, and that Dorothy had mentioned more than once since as the sort of place I wouldn't mind waking up in. The price was within reach. The description promised original character, established gardens, and the quiet charm of a property that has been part of this community for generations. 11 photographs. Golden hour light. The house is barely visible beneath a glorious, flowering cascade of green vines, the kind of image that ends up captioned heritage and timeless in English countryside magazines. Dorothy texted Walter one line, "This one." He rang her back in 4 minutes. The estate agent's name was Gerard Holloway. Smooth as a freshly ironed shirt. He had the particular gift of a man who makes you feel like the most informed person in the room while quietly making every decision for you. He described the property with the confidence of someone who knows it well: the original construction, the established vine growth that gave the cottage its name, the steady appreciation of property values in the area. He also mentioned, casually, almost as an afterthought, that there was significant interest from other parties. In a market like this, a property with character at this price point. Gone in a week, if you weren't quick. Walter and Dorothy, who had spent a lifetime losing things to people who moved faster, understood that pressure in their bones. They asked about viewing it in person. Gerard explained that the sellers were abroad. A scheduling issue. He could arrange a viewing in the coming weeks, though, of course, by then. They talked about it for 2 evenings. They rang Claire, who was careful in the way of someone who loves her parents completely and is trying to protect them without making it feel like interference. They looked at the photographs again. And again. On the 3rd evening, Walter rang Gerard and made the offer. The money was transferred on a Friday morning. By Friday afternoon, Walter and Dorothy Sinclair were the proud owners of Hawthorne Cottage, Crestfield, Virginia. Dorothy wept when the confirmation email landed. Not from sadness. From the sheer weight of finally. 53 years of the first of the month arriving, and the rent being due, and the roof over their heads belonging to someone else. And now, at last, it didn't. They drove to Crestfield on a Saturday in May, the removal lorry following behind. Dorothy had the listing photographs printed and in her lap for part of the journey, which Walter didn't mention, though he noticed. She'd studied them so often she could describe each one from memory. The particular shade of the flowering vines. The stone path disappears into the garden's depth. The suggestion of a window frame beneath a curtain of green. They turned onto Millbrook Lane at 11 in the morning. Quiet street. Old trees. Well-kept houses. The kind of neighborhood where people had clearly decided to stay. Should be this next one, Dorothy said. Walter slowed. The house was there. Recognizable from the photographs, the way a person is recognizable from a picture taken 20 years ago, the basic shape present, but the details telling a story the image hadn't. The vines were there, certainly. More than in the photographs. Considerably more. Not charming overgrowth, a dense, decades-long accumulation that had swallowed the facade, climbed past the roofline, crept along the sides, and found its way under the eaves. The stone path from the listing was invisible beneath uncut growth. The established garden was a tangle of shrubs and weeds left to fight it out for what looked like several years. The front gate was rusted solid. The photographs were old, Walter said carefully. They sat in silence for a moment. Then Walter opened the car door. The smell reached him before he was halfway to the front door. Damp. Vegetative. And underneath it, something older. The smell of a sealed place that hadn't breathed properly in years. He found the door under a curtain of vines and used the key Gerard had posted to him. The lock turned. He pushed it open. The interior was dim, the windows so thoroughly covered that almost no light got through. When his eyes adjusted, what he saw confirmed everything the smell had been suggesting. The ceiling bore a water stain that covered most of its surface. The concentrated brown ring of leaks that had happened repeatedly and never been repaired. The walls were streaked with the grey-black pattern of mold that had been left to spread without challenge. The floorboards were original, he could see that, but they gave softly underfoot in a way that wood floors should never give. He went back outside to Dorothy. "It needs work," he said. She read his face the way she'd been reading it for 53 years. "How much work?" He looked at the house. at the vines covering it so completely that the condition of the walls beneath was impossible to judge. "I don't know yet," he said honestly. "Let's go in together." The first week at Hawthorne Cottage was an education in how hope, held for a very long time, adjusts itself to reality. Walter was not a man who catastrophized. He'd spent 50 years in manufacturing, where problems were identified, assessed, and addressed. Not panicked over. Addressed. He brought this same approach to the house. What he found was considerable. And none of it was good. The roof hadn't been maintained in years, the water damage inside told that story clearly. The electrical system needed complete replacement. The licensed electrician Walter, called on day 3, described the situation with the careful language of a professional who cannot minimize what he is seeing but would prefer not to cause a cardiac event in a 78-year-old man. The plumbing had multiple failure points. And behind a door in the kitchen, a door they hadn't known existed, the basement had standing water. Dorothy made lists. 3 pages of a legal pad in 4 days. Methodical. No drama. What was known, what was unknown, what needed to happen and in what order. On the 4th evening, she sat at the card table they'd set up in the front room, the good furniture still in the lorry, parked outside while they assessed the floors, and she looked at those 3 pages. She thought about the folder in the desk drawer. 30 years of photographs. 30 years of not yet slowly becoming now. She allowed herself, privately and briefly, to feel the full distance between what she had imagined and what she was looking at. Then she closed the legal pad. She made tea on the camp stove she'd had the foresight to pack, because Dorothy Sinclair had been managing contingencies her whole life and knew to prepare for them, and brought Walter his cup. "We've been through harder," she said. He looked at her. "Name one." She thought for a moment. 1988, when the plant cuts shifts. 4 months on reduced pay, 2 kids in school, Claire's orthodontist bills. He was quiet. "Fair." And 2004. Your dad's illness. Driving to Columbus every weekend for 7 months while you had that shoulder surgery. Also fair. "This is a house," she said. "A bad house. But it's our house. Nobody can ring us up and say they need it back." He put his hand over hers. There was nothing to add. The gardening crew came on the morning of day 8. Their neighbor, a small precise man named Edwin Marsh, had recommended them. Edwin was 73, had lived on Millbrook Lane for 28 years, and knew the history of every property on it the way long-term residents know things, not in documents, but in the accumulated memory of having been present. He'd come over on day 2 with a fruitcake and the open face of someone who had information and was still deciding how much of it to share. 2 workers arrived at 8 sharp, equipped for serious vine removal, with the professional detachment of men who have seen worse and do not editorialize. Walter explained what he wanted: clear the front facade, the sides as far as they could reach, and the path to the door. He wanted to see the house. Understand what he was working with. They began on the left side and worked toward the center. Walter and Dorothy stood in the garden and watched. As the first large section came away, what was beneath it stopped them both. The wood of the facade, exposed to daylight for what looked like the first time in years, was in a state of material failure that Walter recognized immediately from a lifetime of manufacturing. Not weathered. Not aged gracefully. Failed. The crew chief spoke quietly. The vines had not merely been growing on the house. They had been growing into it. Through it. Their root systems had penetrated the wood and old mortar and become, in the most alarming sense of the word, structural. When the crew pulled a large section from the center of the facade, the wall moved. Not collapsed. Not immediately. Moved. In the way things move when what was holding them together has just been removed. A crack appeared, running from the roofline straight down. "Stop," the crew chief said. He turned to Walter. "The vegetation is load-bearing." Walter looked at the crack. He looked at Dorothy. But mostly he wept for the dream. The dream that had carried them through every move, every landlord's phone call, every Sunday morning drive through neighborhoods they weren't yet ready to join. The dream of a deed with their names on it, and no one else's claim. The dream of a place that could not be taken back. Dorothy held him. She did not tell him it would be all right. She didn't yet know if it would be. But beneath the grief, With the part of her mind that was always already working on what comes next, one thought moved steadily. There has to be something we can do. Edwin appeared at the garden gate at 11:30. He had read the situation correctly and understood that fruitcake was not the right instrument this time. He brought nothing. He simply came. He looked at the condemned notice on the wall. The crack in the facade. Walter and Dorothy on the path. "I was afraid of this," he said. "You knew," Walter said. Edwin sat down carefully on the low garden wall. "Not everything. I knew the house had been condemned. I saw the notice go up 4 years ago. I knew it had been sitting empty since. I didn't know it had been sold. I didn't know anyone was coming." "Gerard Holloway," Dorothy said. Edwin's expression shifted. No surprise. Recognition, the confirmation of something he'd already suspected. "Holloway," he said, "the way you say a name you've been waiting to hear. I thought it might be him. He's had his fingers in a few distressed properties around here. He's good at finding people who don't know which questions to ask." "We didn't know which questions to ask," Walter said. "No self-pity. Just an accurate statement of fact." "Most people don't," Edwin said. "That's what he counts on." He told them what he knew. The cottage had been built in the 1880s by an architect named Joseph Hartwell, who had designed several buildings in the region before dying in 1929 with no direct heirs. The property had passed through several owners in the decades since, the last of whom had departed abruptly 4 years ago under circumstances Edwin described as unclear, and the house had been vacant since. The county had condemned it within a year. What right did Holloway have to sell a condemned property? Walter asked. "Legally? Not much. But the question is what he disclosed to you before you signed. Did the contract mention the condemnation?" Walter and Dorothy looked at each other. They had read the contract. Claire had helped them through it on a video call. The language had been dense. Gerard had been reassuringly explanatory about each clause. "We need to find the contract," Dorothy said. "Yes," Edwin said. "And you need a solicitor who handles property fraud." He said the word fraud the way he said everything else. Not dramatically. Accurately. Then he paused. "There's something else," he said. "About the house. About what Hartwell may have left behind." He looked at the gap in the facade where the vines had been removed. At the crack. "The gardening crew, are they finished for today?" "We sent them home," Walter said. "Good." Edwin studied the gap in the wall. When Hartwell built, he was known for 2 things. Building to last and keeping his important documents inside the structure itself rather than in a bank. He'd apparently read about houses destroyed in fires and decided institutions were less permanent than good stonework. He paused. He built concealed cavities into several of his structures. Sealed spaces. "I don't know if this house has one. But I know Hartwell built this house. And I know that the wall section that came down is on the interior facing side, which is where, based on everything I've read about his other buildings, the sealed space would be." Walter and Dorothy both looked at the house. "What are you saying?" Dorothy asked. "I'm saying," Edwin said carefully, "that before you call the solicitor, it might be worth looking at what's inside that wall." They went in together. The 3 of them. Torches in hand. Moving carefully through the condemned structure, aware of the floors beneath them, aware of the ceiling's declining commitment to its job. The cracked section of wall was in the front room, to the right of the main entrance. The crack had opened wide enough to reveal the interior cavity, the space between the inner plaster and the outer wood, which in a structure this old was considerable. Edwin held his torch to the gap. "There," he said. Walter looked. It was a metal box, roughly the size of a large hardback book, mounted on a bracket built into the wall framing. It had a handle and a keyhole with no key. Dark with age, but intact, the sealed cavity had protected it from the moisture that had damaged everything else. They worked at it for 40 minutes, using tools Walter kept in the car out of decades of habit. The bracket had been bolted to the wall studs with hardware set in place over 100 years ago, and it had no intention of cooperating quickly. Walter worked at it with the patience of someone who knows the alternative to patience is damage, and that he'd already had quite enough damage for 1 week. The box came free at 12:20. They carried it to the card table. Dorothy sat across from it. Walter stood beside it. Edwin stood back, because this was their discovery, not his. Walter worked the lock for 20 minutes with a small toolkit from the car. It opened with a sound that was less of a click than a sigh, the sound of something releasing after an extraordinarily long time. Inside, wrapped in oilskin that had kept out every drop of moisture, were documents. Walter unfolded the wrapping carefully. Dorothy came round the table to stand beside him. The documents were handwritten in the precise penmanship of someone who knew what he was writing would outlast him. Several on paper are yellowed with age but still legible. Several on heavier stock that had held its color. Property deeds. Multiple deeds. All in the name of Joseph Hartwell. Parcels of land across Crestfield County and the surrounding region. Edwin, who had come forward now and was reading quietly over their shoulders, began naming the locations, and with each one, his voice became more careful. The voice of someone who knows this land and is understanding, as he reads, exactly what he is looking at. There was also a letter. Addressed to no one in particular. Written by the date, in 1926, 3 years before Hartwell died. Walter read it aloud in the dim room, lantern light, the sound of the May morning coming in from outside. Hartwell had written that he had no children. That his family had gone before him. That he had spent his life building things and accumulating land, in the belief that land was the only thing that didn't diminish when you weren't attending to it. He had placed these documents inside the house because he trusted the house more than he trusted the institutions of his time. He had written, "To whoever finds this, these lands belong to the one who was meant to find them. To whoever had the patience to wait for the walls to speak." Dorothy put her hand over her mouth. Walter set the letter down. Edwin, still reading the deeds, said quietly, "These properties. Several of them, I know these parcels. I've watched them sit for years." He stopped. He looked at Walter and Dorothy. "You're going to need a solicitor," he said again. But in a completely different tone than before. "Not just for Holloway. For this." The solicitor's name was Margaret Foyle. Edwin had used her for his own estate planning and recommended her the way he recommended everything, with specific reasons, not vague praise. She was, he said, someone who didn't waste words or time. She came to the property 2 days after the discovery and read every document at the card table with the focused attention of someone for whom documents are a first language. She read them twice, made notes, asked precise questions about the purchase terms and every communication with Holloway. Then she set her pen down. "The good news," she said, "is that you have a case." The condemnation notice was public record. Any agent representing this property was legally required to disclose it. Vegetation covering it changes nothing. He would have known through the county records, and he had an obligation to tell you. She looked at the deeds. The Hartwell documents are more complex. These are legitimate historical property records. Whether they convey active rights depends on a title search for each parcel. Some may have been legally transferred since Hartwell's death. Some may not have been. Those that haven't, the ones with no clear title chain, would potentially still belong to the Hartwell estate, which, with no heirs, would revert to the county. Unless, she paused, there's a mechanism to claim them. And the fact that you found them on property you legally purchased creates a rather interesting legal question about what rights attach. She began title searches the next morning. Filed the fraud complaint against Holloway with the county and the state real estate board that same afternoon. The title searches took 3 weeks. Walter and Dorothy spent those 3 weeks in a short-term rental. Margaret had helped them find the condemned property couldn't legally be occupied. Walter had made clear he was not driving back to Ohio. He was not ready to leave Crestfield. He was not ready to leave a property that was a disaster and a condemned ruin, and also the place where a wall had come down and shown them something that might change everything. He was 78 years old, and he had been patient for 53 years. He was not done yet. Margaret called on a Wednesday morning. She was, Walter had noticed, a person who made important calls before the day could complicate things. Of the 11 parcels in Hartwell's deeds, 4 had been legally transferred over the decades and belonged, without question, to their current owners. 7 had not. 7 parcels of land across Crestfield County had sat in a kind of legal limbo for nearly 100 years. Not abandoned. Not claimed. Simply unnoticed, in the way things go unnoticed when nobody is looking for them. The combined assessed value of those 7 parcels, Margaret said, was, and here she used the careful language of a solicitor who won't create expectations she can't guarantee, but who also cannot in good conscience minimize what she is seeing, significant. The legal process would take time. It would involve the county, the state, and potentially the courts. Margaret did not minimize the complexity. But she said, with the directness Edwin had promised, "I believe you have a legitimate path. And I believe we should walk it." Gerard Holloway was served with a civil complaint that same week. Margaret informed them, with what Walter recognized as neutral professional satisfaction, that the County Real Estate Commission had also opened an investigation. Their filing had helped bring a pattern of similar transactions to light. Holloway had done this before. He would not, it appeared, have the opportunity to do it again. The construction began in September. Tom Briggs, their builder, another Edwin recommendation, delivered with specific reasons, had been working in the region for 30 years. He walked the property with Walter the way Walter liked, questions about load and materials and sequencing, and answers delivered with the respect of a man recognizing someone who knows how to think about physical systems. Most of the original structure had to come down. Watching the walls fall was harder than finding the condemnation notice, because it was final in a way the notice had not been. But the foundation was sound. Hartwell had built it to last, and it had lasted, and Tom said. It was the kind of foundation you didn't replace, only built upon. They kept the foundation. They repaired the stone path, stone by stone. They kept, at Walter's specific request, the original front door frame, solid oak, found intact beneath the overgrowth, and Tom incorporated it into the new entrance. And they kept the vines. Not the structural growth that had penetrated the walls. But along the left side of the property, where a stone arch had been part of the original garden design, and where the vines had grown ornamentally rather than destructively, Dorothy had asked for those to stay. Walter had understood without needing to ask why. The vines were the beginning of the story. They would be part of the ending. The construction took 4 months. Dorothy made every interior decision with the focused certainty of someone who has been thinking about this for 30 years and knows precisely what she wants. The kitchen window is positioned to catch morning light. A real fireplace in the sitting room, with a hearth she'd chosen from samples Tom brought to the rental flat. The spare room is designed for grandchildren, bunk beds, a window seat, and storage for the toys that would arrive. Walter built a garden bench himself, with Tom's occasional consultation, in the corner of the yard where the afternoon light fell best. He was not a woodworker by training. But he was a man who had spent 50 years working with his hands, and he understood the fundamental principles of making something solid. The bench was not perfect. A craftsman would have found things to improve. But it was sturdy, and it was his, and when Dorothy sat on it that first afternoon and told him it was the most comfortable bench she'd ever sat on, he received it as the gift it was very clearly intended to be. They moved in on a Thursday in January. Cold. Clear. The mountains are visible to the west in that particular winter light. Walter carried the box with Dorothy's folder. 30 years of clipped photographs, printed listings, torn magazine pages, and placed it on the desk in her reading room. She would keep it. Not because they were still searching, but because the searching had been part of life, and you kept the things that had been part of the life. The legal resolution came in March. Margaret called on a Tuesday morning. Of the 7 Hartwell parcels, 5 had been upheld by the court. 2 had been ruled against on technical grounds. Margaret had prepared them for that possibility. 5 parcels remained. The appraised value of those 5 parcels, in current market conditions, required Walter to sit down when he heard it. He sat at the kitchen table. The good table, the one from the rented house they'd lived in for 14 years, with the scratch on the left corner from when Claire was 9 and pushed her bicycle through the kitchen. He looked out the window at the garden, where the winter was loosening its grip, and the first green was showing where Dorothy had planted bulbs in October. He thought about 1969. The basement flat on Grover Street. The clanking radiator. $42 a month feels like a fortune. He thought about Dorothy at 22, making that small, damp flat feel like home through sheer resourcefulness. The afternoon he'd come back from the plant to find she'd painted the kitchen wall, just the one wall, the one that caught the afternoon light, a warm yellow that made the whole place feel different. He hadn't asked her to do it. She'd seen that it needed doing. He thought about the folder. 30 years thick. He thought about a Tuesday morning in early spring when a listing appeared on the screen, and Dorothy had sent it to him with 2 words, this one. The worst moment of their lives, the garden path, the condemned notice, the crack in the wall, had led directly to the best thing that had ever happened to them. Which was not the thing that mattered most. But it was nothing. Gerard Holloway had his license revoked. The civil case was settled in a manner that returned to Walter and Dorothy the full amount they had paid, with additional damages. The criminal investigation that followed uncovered 3 further similar transactions. Margaret described the outcome with the neutral satisfaction of a solicitor who has done her job correctly. On a Saturday in April, when the garden was coming into itself, tentatively at first, then with increasing confidence, the way April gardens do, Dorothy invited Edwin Marsh for dinner. She made the meal herself in the kitchen with the morning light window. They ate at the good table and talked about the parcels, 2 of which they intended to donate to the Crestfield Land Trust, and 3 of which they intended to hold. After dinner, Walter took Edwin out to see the arch. The vines along the left side had come back with the spring, responding to the training Dorothy had done in autumn with the particular determination of plants that know what they want to do. The arch framed the garden entrance in a way that was both new and felt as though it had always been there. Edwin stood and looked at it. She wanted to keep them, Walter said. It wasn't a question. Of course she did, Edwin said. Walter understood. The vines had covered the condemned notice. The vines had penetrated the walls and brought them down, which had exposed the box, which had led to everything that followed. The vines had been, simultaneously, the disaster and the key to ending it. Dorothy came out of the house carrying 3 cups of tea, distributed with the practical grace of someone who has been looking after people her whole life and doesn't make a performance of it. She stood beside Walter under the arch. The 3 of them looked at the garden in the April light. At the bulbs coming up in the border. At the bench in the corner where the afternoon light fell best. Do you know what I kept thinking? Dorothy said. In those first days. When we were on the garden path, and everything had fallen apart? What? Edwin asked. That it wasn't fair. 53 years. Every rent payment. Every time we moved, it was because someone needed the place back. And then this. She paused. But then I thought, all those years of renting, we also never had a roof fall in on us. Never had to deal with a failed foundation. Never had a wall come down. She looked at the arch. If we'd bought a house 20 years ago, we'd have bought the wrong house. We were ready for this one. Walter put his arm around her. They had paid rent for 53 years. And the house they finally owned had walls that came down to show them where the treasure was. They had been deceived by a greedy man whose scheme had led them, accidentally, to something no amount of careful planning could have found. They had come to Crestfield looking for a refuge. They had found something closer to a calling. If you have ever waited so long for something that the waiting became part of who you are. If you have ever had the ground give way beneath a dream you'd carried for decades. If you have ever sat on a garden path and watched everything you'd worked for turn to rubble. This story is for you. Because Walter and Dorothy Sinclair didn't find a perfect house. They found something better. Proof that the worst arrivals sometimes carry the best beginnings inside them if you have the courage to stay long enough to look. Some walls have to fall before you can see what they were hiding. Share this with someone who needs reminding that life isn't finished with them yet. Drop a comment below. Have you ever had a disaster turn into a blessing? Every story on this channel exists to prove it's never too late. See you in the next one. Herb.